usually when we think about history, we kind of imagine it like a grand unfolding map.
Right, like an atlas or something.
Yeah, exactly. The borders are clearly drawn, the rivers are charted, and, the mountain ranges are all labeled in this neat black ink.
It feels very safe, right? Very settled.
Exactly. There's a comfort in that kind of categorization. We look at the map and say, okay, this is how the world was.
We're basically taught to look at historical narratives as these visible, linear, and just clearly categorized things.
But then, and this is where it gets wild, you step into the history of indigenous gender and sexuality here in North America,
Right.
and suddenly you realize that the map we've been looking at,
Oh, yeah. It's completely flawed.
right, it was drawn by someone who intentionally erased half the landscape. So today we are opening up this 90-page document that attempts to redraw that exact map.
And it is a dense, powerful text.
It really is. The mission for this deep dive is to explore the 2021 final report, which is titled the MMIWG2SLGBTQQIA plus National Action Plan.
Which, just for some background for you listening, was written by the 2SLGBTQQIA plus subworking group.
Right. And it acts as a companion to the national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. But, what makes this specific document so distinct is its laser focus.
Yeah, it specifically addresses the systemic erasure, the historical violence, and honestly, the incredible resilience of Indigenous Two-Spirit and gender-diverse people in Canada.
And as we navigate this text, I want you to kind of guide us. Your role today is to help synthesize these really complex historical frameworks the authors are presenting.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we really need to look at how they explain the mechanics of this erasure.
Because it wasn't an accident.
No, not at all. And I want to explain why they argue that the recommendations laid out in this report aren't just, minor policy updates. They're foundational steps meant to dismantle centuries of ingrained colonial structures.
Exactly. We want to establish right at the top that the authors aren't just handing us some dry summary of government policies.
Right. It's so much more than that.
It's an exploration of lost histories and deliberate erasure. And, they're presenting what they consider a total blueprint for cultural resurgence.
So before we can even begin to understand the violence detailed in the report or the action plan they propose to stop it.
We have to understand who the report is actually about.
Exactly. The text asks us to look at how Indigenous concepts of gender radically, and I mean fundamentally, differ from Western norms.
And language is a huge part of that, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the authors dedicate a significant portion of the text just to the lexicon of identity.
They really do. The language we use to describe human experience matters immensely.
Yeah. And the report uses a very specific acronym throughout, which is 2SLGBTQQIA plus 2ASIG. Let's walk through what the authors are communicating here.
So it stands for Two-Spirit, lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, questioning, intersex, and asexual.
But what I found particularly striking, and this really caught my eye, is how the report frames the plus at the end.
Oh, yeah, the plus is fascinating in this context.
Yeah, right. Because in a lot of mainstream contexts, we see the plus used as this sort of, mathematical catch-all for anything else not listed.
Like the miscellaneous category.
Exactly. But the report frames the plus as a cultural celebration. The authors describe it as a marker of how Indigenous languages are continuously expanding.
They're evolving to offer choices for sexual and gender-diverse relatives to identify themselves. It's presented as this dynamic, living thing.
Which is such a beautiful way to look at it. And then the report places a heavy emphasis on the origin of the term Two-Spirit itself.
Yeah, which is actually a relatively modern English language term, historically speaking.
Wait, really? How modern are we talking?
The text explains that it was formally introduced in 1990 by Elder Myra Laramie. This was at an annual Native American gay and lesbian gathering in Winnipeg.
Okay, let's pause there for a second and look at that context. Why was a new term needed in 1990?
Well, the report points out that prior to this, the terminology forced on these communities was often rooted in really early colonial anthropology.
Right, those really loaded historical terms.
Exactly. There were words heavily utilized by settlers like burdake, which the text notes was a highly offensive term. It essentially meant a subordinate or a kept person.
Oh, wow. That's incredibly demeaning.
Yes. The text outlines how early anthropologists observed these complex Indigenous gender roles and, lacking any cultural framework to understand them, just slapped these derogatory European labels on them.
Labels associated with deviance.
Right. So the adoption of Two-Spirit in 1990 wasn't just about coining a catchy new word. The authors frame it as an act of profound reclamation.
So it was adopted as a pan-Indigenous term to honor those with male, female, or non-gendered spirits.
Exactly. It created a unified identifier for a community that had been systematically fragmented by those settler labels.
But here is the historical data point from the text that really challenges that conventional map we talked about earlier.
The linguistic data, right?
Yes. The authors highlight that before European contact, in over 2/3 of the 200 indigenous languages spoken in North America, there were already specific, culturally integrated terms for individuals who were neither exclusively men nor women.
2/3 of the languages across an entire continent.
That is just massive. And the report emphasizes that these individuals were not marginalized anomalies.
No, the authors are very clear that these individuals held vital, central roles within their communities.
Yeah, based on the historical research presented, they were the healers, the knowledge keepers. They were mediators, visionaries, artists, and childminders.
Their existence wasn't merely tolerated, which is how we sometimes frame modern acceptance. It was woven into the very survival and social fabric of the community.
Okay, let's unpack this logic here, because this is a massive paradigm shift. It's kind of like society today is finally trying to upgrade to a complex, multidimensional operating system for gender and sexuality.
I like that analogy.
But indigenous communities were already running an advanced 3D color operating system centuries ago.
Right, before a black and white screen was forced over it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Think of it less like an operating system, though, and more like an ecosystem. Mainstream Western gender was treated a bit like a monocrop farm.
Just corn and wheat, strictly separated into two fields.
Yeah, and anything else is just a weed to be pulled. But the indigenous approach described in the report was like a companion planting garden.
Like the traditional Three Sisters method of planting corn, beans, and squash together.
Exactly that. The existence of a third or fourth element wasn't a weed or an anomaly. It was the exact thing enriching the soil and supporting the structure for everything else.
That is a very accurate way to visualize the framework the authors are building. And what's fascinating here is how the report explicitly asks the reader to separate our modern Western conflation of gender and sexual orientation.
Right, because we usually lump those together.
We do. The authors argue that Western frameworks often tie gender purely to a physical, biological, or anatomical understanding. But the indigenous worldview views gender and sexuality as an interrelated identity deeply tied to spirituality.
So it's not just a social label for them.
According to the report, no. Two-spirit people are historically recognized as conduits between the physical world and the spiritual world.
Oh, wow. That's a huge distinction.
It is. The authors argue that it is not just about who you love or how you express yourself outwardly. It is viewed as a sacred spiritual placement within the cosmos.
So they might have very specific community functions based on that spiritual placement.
Exactly. A two-spirit person might have been called upon to mediate a dispute between a men's camp and a women's camp, precisely because they were recognized as holding the perspectives of both.
Or existing outside the binary conflicts of either.
Right. They were essential to maintaining the balance.
Okay, so the authors have established this picture of the traditional reverence for two-spirit people, this integrated, companion-planted ecosystem.
Which brings us to the really difficult part of the text.
Yeah, the text then forces us to confront how that specific ecosystem was destroyed. The report transitions into detailing the architecture of erasure, and the authors introduce a word that carries an incredible amount of weight: gendercide.
That is a very heavy term. The report defines gendercide as the intentional, systematic killing of a specific gender group.
Which we usually hear in other contexts, right?
Yeah, we often hear this term applied in historical contexts to the targeting of women and girls. But the authors of this report explicitly expand this definition.
They use it to describe the historical extermination of trans, non-binary, and two-spirit people by colonial forces.
And the report traces this timeline all the way back to first contact with Spanish colonizers in the 16th century.
The text describes how these colonizers arrived, driven by a really rigid 16th century Euro-Christian intolerance.
They encountered gender-diverse indigenous people. The report specifically mentions individuals known in some regions as the Joyas.
And the Spanish reacted with what the authors describe as absolute calculated violence. Let's delve into the mechanics of that. The report suggests this wasn't just random prejudice, right?
No, it was entirely systemic.
So what did that 16th century Euro-Christian mindset actually look like in practice when it hit these communities?
Well, the text situates this within the broader context of the Inquisition-era European mindset. They were intensely intolerant of any sexual or gender expression outside of heteronormative procreation within a recognized marriage.
Basically, anything else was deemed a mortal sin.
Exactly. So when Spanish military and religious figures encountered indigenous societies that openly honored gender fluidity, they believed they were encountering something that had to be entirely eradicated to establish a civilized colonial rule.
So the violence was public, it was punitive, and it was designed to terrorize communities into abandoning their two-spirit members.
Yes. The Spanish didn't just want the territory. The authors argue they wanted to enforce a strict patriarchal domination, and the report makes a very striking claim here.
What's that?
It states that the notion of the closet was literally brought over on the boats by Europeans.
Wow. That's a chilling way to frame it. The closet didn't exist until it was imported as a survival mechanism.
Exactly.
So the Spanish set this precedent of moral violence. But the report points out that it was the Canadian state that later turned that violence into rigid bureaucracy.
Right, moving from swords to paperwork.
They didn't just use physical force, they used legislation. Well, let's look at how the report details the 1876 Indian Act. The authors don't mince words here.
No, they don't. They describe the Indian Act as an ongoing tool of oppression and genocide.
Specifically noting how it legally enforced the male-female binary.
The report analyzes the Indian Act as a mechanism designed to tear down complex indigenous political systems and replace them with state nationalism, capitalism, and what the authors term settler subjectivity.
Wait, let's ground that for a second. Settler subjectivity and heteropatriarchy. These are heavy academic terms the authors use frequently.
They are very academic, yes.
So what did that actually look like for an indigenous family or a two-spirit person trying to live their life in, say, 1880 under this act?
Well, the authors use heteropatriarchy to describe a social and legal system where cisgender, heterosexual men hold the primary power and are viewed as the default authority.
Okay. And settler subjectivity.
In the context of the report, that's the mindset that this specific European way of living is the only valid civilized way to exist.
So how did the Indian Act enforce that on the ground, like practically speaking?
The report breaks down the mechanics. The Indian Act literally defined who was legally considered an Indian and who had rights to live on reserve land.
And they defined this strictly through a male-dominated binary lens, right?
Exactly. Status was passed down through the male line. If an indigenous woman married a non-indigenous man, the state stripped her of her status, separating her from her community.
Wow. And what did that mean for family structures?
By strictly defining families as a male head of household and his dependent wife and children, the act legally erased any other family structure.
So if you were a two-spirit person who didn't fit into the rigid category of husband or wife, you essentially ceased to exist in the eyes of the colonial state.
Precisely. You couldn't be a recognized leader. You couldn't legally hold property in the way the state demanded. The text argues this actively criminalized and erased the two-spirit identity from the legal and social fabric.
And then, of course, the report moves from the bureaucratic erasure of the Indian Act to the physical and psychological erasure of the Indian residential schools.
And later, the 60s and Millennium Scoops.
Right. The authors describe the explicitly stated goal of the residential school system as killing the Indian in the child. And they argue that a massive, specific pillar of that was killing any non-binary gender expression.
The text highlights that the religious orders running these schools viewed indigenous spiritual leaders, many of whom historically held two-spirit roles, as sorcerers or negative influences.
So they specifically targeted them.
Yes. The authors argue that the schools systematically targeted traditional gender expressions to discredit indigenous spiritual practices and implement theological indoctrination.
And what did that targeting look like for the kids?
Inside the schools, children were forcibly stripped of their traditional clothing, their hair was cut to conform to Western gender standards, and they were segregated into rigid male or female dormitories and labor categories.
There's an account included in the report's research that really illustrates the human cost of this mechanical segregation.
The story of two-spirit elder Laurie MacDonald.
Yes, the authors share his story, and it's just heartbreaking. The text describes how he grew up in a family environment that actually celebrated him as two-spirit. He knew who he was within his cultural context, and he was accepted.
But the narrative shifts entirely when he was taken to the Ermineskin residential school. The report uses his story to demonstrate the agonizing psychological dichotomy these children faced.
Exactly. The text describes how he suddenly had to hide his entire identity. He realized that if he expressed his natural, culturally celebrated two-spirit nature, he would be subjected to intense, targeted abuse from the priests and the school staff.
He had to compress himself into a closet that, as the authors noted earlier, his own culture hadn't even built.
It's just devastating. And the report points out that Laurie's experience is echoed across countless testimonies.
Yeah, the authors reference findings from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, noting that two-spirit children faced numerous, specialized attacks on their identities within the schools.
And there's another crucial layer of erasure the report identifies here, which is the loss of language.
Right, because the schools strictly forbade children from speaking their mother tongues.
So those specific, nuanced, indigenous words for these diverse genders, the ones from the two-thirds of languages we mentioned earlier, were suppressed.
The text argues that the words that held their spiritual and community roles were literally beaten out of a generation.
Which the authors frame as an absolute tragedy. Because, as the report notes, language is the primary vehicle for transmitting cultural knowledge.
If you lose the word for a concept, you lose the concept itself.
Exactly. You lose the social role. But as I was reading through the author's timeline of colonization, there was another historical event they linked to gender oppression that initially caught me completely off guard.
The destruction of the bison.
Yes. The report connects the historical slaughter of the bison herds on the plains directly to the loss of gender fluidity. I have to admit, I stared at that page for a minute.
It seems like a massive leap at first glance.
Right. What is the mechanical link the authors are making between an environmental catastrophe on the plains and gender oppression?
It is actually one of the more profound systemic connections the authors make in the text. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the report links ecological destruction directly to social engineering.
How so? Walk us through the mechanics of that as the authors describe it.
So, the text outlines that when colonial forces, either through deliberate government policy aimed at clearing the plains, or through disruptive commercial hunting decimated the massive bison herds, they systematically destroyed the foundational economy.
The shelter, the primary food source of the plains indigenous nations.
Precisely. They removed the cornerstone of their physical survival.
Okay, so they're starving. What happens next?
The authors explain that with the sudden loss of the bison, these indigenous nations lost their economic independence. They were forced into a position of absolute dependency on colonial government rations simply to avoid mass starvation.
And here is where the Indian Act comes back in, right?
Exactly. The report details how those life-saving rations were distributed by Indian agents representatives of the colonial government.
And they had rules for who got the food.
Very strict rules. These agents utilized the distribution of food to enforce the rules of the Indian Act. The authors point out that agents would often only distribute rations to recognized male heads of household.
Oh, wow. So if you were a two-spirit person living outside that nuclear family structure or a community organized around a different traditional model, you literally didn't get food.
That is the argument the text presents. To survive, to literally feed their families, communities were forced into compliance.
They had to adopt the Eurocentric, heteropatriarchal family and economic structures just to get rations.
Yes. The report posits that the destruction of the land's resources was the precise lever used to force compliance with colonial gender binaries.
The authors argue you cannot separate the theft and destruction of the land from the forced dismantling of their traditional gender systems.
They're completely intertwined.
So the environmental destruction was the catalyst for forced cultural assimilation. The authors really paint a picture of a multi-pronged assault: physical, legislative, psychological, and ecological.
It was a very comprehensive system of erasure.
So, having established this incredibly deep historical foundation of damage, the gendercide, the Indian Act, the residential schools, the starvation tactics, the report shifts its focus.
Right, moving from the history to the present analysis.
The authors ask, how do we analyze these compounding issues today? Because the text clearly argues that standard Western academic tools and government policy frameworks aren't adequately capturing this reality.
No, the authors argue they fall severely short. And this leads to a major analytical critique in the report regarding the concept of intersectionality.
Specifically as it is typically used by governments, right?
Yes, mainstream gender-based analysis.
Right, intersectionality. For context for you listening, this is a framework coined by the brilliant American legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw in the late 1980s.
A really foundational concept.
Absolutely. The core idea is that you can't just look at someone's race or just their gender in a vacuum to understand their disadvantage. Her original work pointed out that a black woman experiences the world and the legal system differently than a white woman or a black man.
Because her identities intersect to create unique, compounded forms of discrimination.
Exactly. It's a foundational concept in modern sociology.
Yeah.
But the authors of the National Action Plan report argue that mainstream gender-based analysis, even when it claims to be utilizing intersectionality, still manages to systemically erase two-spirit people.
They do make that claim, yes.
Why do they say that? How does a tool meant to see overlapping identities fail to see them?
Well, the report claims that mainstream analysis almost always defaults to a Western understanding of what gender and sexuality fundamentally are.
Okay, so it starts with a flawed baseline.
Right. It assumes the categories of man, woman, gay, or straight as universal baselines, and then attempts to stack racial or economic disadvantages on top of them.
So it treats the Indigenous experience as just a flavor of the mainstream queer experience.
Yes, rather than a distinct sovereign identity targeted by a specific history of gendercide. The authors argue this misses the spiritual and deep colonial context of the two-spirit identity entirely.
So, to correct this analytical blind spot, the 2SLGBTQQIA plus subworking group designed a totally new, Indigenous-specific analytical framework.
And it's a really beautiful, intuitive framework.
It really is. When I was reading this section on intersectionality, I kind of struggled with the academic framing until I hit their visual model. They use this striking concept, the metaphor of the fire.
Yes, the fire.
Can we walk through exactly how the authors mapped this out?
It's a highly effective conceptual tool. The text notes that fire is a staple in every Indigenous culture, traditionally centered in lodges, tipis, and homes.
It's a necessity for life, gathering, and survival.
Exactly. So the authors use the anatomy of a fire to build a new, comprehensive model of intersectionality.
Let's break down the anatomy of this fire as the report describes it. First, the authors ask us to picture the stones ringing the outside of the fire. In their diagram, these are colored gray.
And the text explains that the stones represent the cultural strengths that two-spirit people hold within their communities.
This is their connection to tradition, their roles as knowledge keepers, their inherent spiritual gifts.
Right, it forms the foundation.
Then, inside that protective ring of stones, you have the logs. These are brown. The authors say the logs represent the mainstream intersectional factors we usually think about in policy.
Like a person's age, their geographic location, their level of education, their physical ability.
Exactly. Then, rising up from the logs, you have the flames themselves, colored red.
The report states the flames represent the 2SLGBTQQIA plus specific intersections.
This is where you find the unique heat of their lived experience, right?
Yes, their traditional roles, the specific trauma carried from things like the 60s scoop, the psychological experience of coming into one's identity within an Indigenous context.
And their specific mental and physical health needs. Finally, surrounding the entire fire is the white space.
The white space is crucial to understand. The authors use this space to represent the massive external colonial factors constantly pressing in on the individual.
So things like the ongoing impacts of the Indian Act, systemic homophobia, cissexism, housing insecurity, and food scarcity.
It is a brilliant, encompassing systemic model. The authors are arguing that mainstream intersectionality often just hands a policymaker a pile of logs.
Okay, we have 3 pine logs and 2 oak logs.
Right. They just look at age, income, education, and ask the policymaker to understand why the person is burning.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Mainstream analysis is like trying to understand a complex forest fire by only standing there and counting the logs.
Yes.
But this Indigenous framework proposed in the text demands that you look at the heat of the flames, the specific type of fuel, the cultural stones containing it, and the massive colonial weather systems pressing down on it.
It requires the observer to understand the whole living ecosystem of the fire, and the text outlines exactly why this framework is so utterly vital to their action plan.
Because it completely shifts the narrative paradigm of government intervention, doesn't it?
It really does. The authors argue that mainstream policy often forces the analyst or the social worker to treat two-spirit people merely as marginalized victims.
Just people defined entirely by their compounding oppressions and traumas.
Exactly. But by placing the stones, the cultural strengths, at the very foundation of the fire, the report demands that society recognize two-spirit people as leaders, role models, and knowledge keepers.
Gifted with inherent Indigenous teachings. The authors are framing this not as solving a new problem, but as restoring a leader to their rightful place.
They are demanding that policy center their inherent power, not just their trauma.
That is a massive shift in how a government would approach drafting a health or housing policy. So how is this FIRE framework practically applied in the report?
Well, the authors don't just leave it as abstract academic theory.
No, they take this specific lens and focus it on the raw, qualitative data they gathered from the front lines.
The text details how they spoke directly to highly vulnerable subgroups to understand their specific lived realities through this new intersectional lens.
Yes, the report grounds its policy recommendations in very granular lived experience. The text outlines how they engaged specific consultants to gather this data.
For example, they highlight the work of Patricia Baxter, who spoke extensively with Inuit 2SLGBTQAA plus kin,
And Charlotte Nolan, who consulted with trans and non-binary community members, including those actively involved in sex work. Let's look at the Inuit and trans realities as presented in the text first.
The authors emphasize that the geographical and cultural context of the Arctic creates very specific needs.
Needs that a blanket national policy might just completely miss.
Absolutely. The report highlights an urgent, critical need for Inuit-specific mental health and counseling services.
And the text emphasizes that they don't just need services, they need safe spaces, both physical and online, for Inuit who are self-identifying.
The authors point to geographic isolation as a massive compounding factor here. In remote fly-in communities, there is a total lack of anonymity.
Right, everyone knows everyone.
Exactly. The report notes that Inuit youth continue to experience high rates of violence, discrimination, and bullying.
And crucially, the text points out that they sometimes face marginalization even when they try to access mainstream queer spaces down south.
Because those spaces can be very settler-centric and entirely disconnected from Inuit cultural realities.
So a generic queer youth hotline that's based in Toronto might not understand the specific cultural dynamics an Inuit youth is navigating in Nunavut.
Exactly. The report argues they need resources that are culturally specific to Inuit histories.
Including resources aimed at educating their own communities about how, historically, the Inuit held a strong pre-colonial acceptance of gender diversity.
And regarding trans and non-binary individuals across all Indigenous groups, the report identifies housing security as a massive multi-generational crisis.
The authors are looking at data showing youth, adults, and seniors all facing immense systemic barriers to simply having a safe roof over their heads.
The text draws a direct line showing how housing insecurity funnels these individuals directly into vulnerabilities to physical violence and exploitation.
Which brings us to one of the most sensitive yet absolutely crucial sections of the report, the realities of sex work and human trafficking.
Yes. The authors apply the FIRE framework here to show how multiple colonial factors press in on an individual simultaneously.
Right. And we need to approach this section with the same analytical objectivity the authors ask of their readers. The text notes that many 2SLGBTQQIA plus individuals are essentially pushed out of their home communities.
And the report links this directly back to that imported colonial homophobia and transphobia we talked about earlier.
Individuals are rejected by their families, they migrate to urban centers looking for safety, and many find themselves surviving through the sex trade.
The report details how, once in the urban sex trade, these individuals face a terrifying intersection of vulnerabilities.
The authors point out that they experience hyper-fetishization and racialized violence because they are Indigenous.
Combined with extreme transphobic violence because they are gender diverse, it is a compounding lethal crisis of marginalization.
Now, here is where I found the report's recommendations incredibly thought-provoking, because they push back hard against the narrative we typically hear from politicians or in mainstream media.
The rescue narrative.
Exactly. We often hear policies focused entirely on rescuing people from sex work. The language is usually centered on eradication, saving victims, pulling them out of the life through law enforcement interventions.
But the authors of this report advocate for a very different stance.
They explicitly advocate for legalizing sex trade work, creating safety plans, and providing harm reduction for those who wish to stay in the industry. Why is this perspective so critical? To a lot of people, it might seem counterintuitive to the mainstream goal of ending violence.
This raises an important question, and the authors use this issue to strike at the very heart of what true harm reduction actually means in practice.
So how do they define it?
The report argues that the mainstream narrative of rescue often strips the individual of their agency. It operates on an assumption that these individuals are incapable of making choices about their own survival or their own bodies.
But what did the consultants hear directly from the sex workers?
What is recorded in the text is the argument that criminalization itself is what makes the work deadly.
Right, the mechanics of criminalization. Because if your means of survival is illegal, you absolutely cannot go to the police if a client attacks you, or if a manager steals your wages.
Precisely. The authors argue that if you are criminalized, you are forced into the shadows, into industrial areas, into unsafe situations where predators know you have no legal recourse.
So true harm reduction must center the autonomy of the individual.
Yes. By stripping away the moral judgment, which the authors link back to that Euro-Christian moral judgment imposed centuries ago, they argue society can focus on practical, life-saving measures.
Like having the legal right to negotiate safely with clients, or accessing medical care without a doctor treating you like a criminal.
Yes. The text explicitly calls for culturally safe medical care and, crucially, it advocates for community policing models that exist completely outside of the colonial law enforcement systems.
Wait, how do they explain that working? How do you have policing outside of the police?
The authors base this recommendation on the historical reality that existing police and justice systems have heavily criminalized, misgendered, and harmed these very individuals.
So they don't trust them.
Exactly. The report argues that you cannot rely on the historical source of the trauma to suddenly be the source of safety.
That makes total sense.
By legalizing the trade and providing structural, non-judgmental support, the authors argue you allow those who wish to stay in the industry to do so safely.
And you allow those who wish to leave to do so without a criminal record acting as an anchor that prevents them from getting future housing or employment. It's about meeting people exactly where they are in the reality of the flames they are currently navigating, without judging them for the fuel that brought them there.
That is a great way to summarize the author's logic.
And this narrative intentionality, moving from the raw vulnerability, the front lines, into a space of immense community strength, is exactly how the report progresses.
The authors shift the focus of the text here to concentrate on resiliency, resurgence, and a concept they refer to as futurisms.
They dedicate this section to exploring how 2S LGBTQQIA+ people are reclaiming the pen and writing their own narrative.
The report highlights the staggering resilience of this community, but the authors make a vital point here. They argue that the fight for space and recognition hasn't just been against the Canadian state.
I found this historical context eye-opening. The text documents how it has also been a prolonged fight against erasure within the broader mainstream queer community.
Yes, the report details how Two-Spirit people have been at the absolute forefront of queer rights marches for decades.
They were there at the very beginning of the pride movements and liberation protests. Yet, the authors argue, they were constantly marginalized by white settler-centric queer organizations.
The text points out that settler queerness often failed to recognize the racialized colonial realities of Indigenous people.
The authors argue that mainstream organizations either ignored Two-Spirit people entirely due to systemic racism, or they superficially included them.
Right, like perhaps asking them to open a conference with a prayer, without actually sharing institutional power, funding, or decision-making authority.
So, how did Two-Spirit people respond to this dual exclusion from the state and the mainstream queer community?
They built their own infrastructure.
Yeah, the report lists all these incredible self-determined organizations that sprang up. The text mentions the Greater Vancouver Native Cultural Center, Two-Spirited People of the First Nations in Toronto, the Wabanaki Two-Spirit Alliance out east, and the Two Spirits in Motion Society.
The authors frame this as a realization that waiting for settler inclusion was a trap.
Leading these communities to create their own culturally safe models of service for their own kin.
And the authors tie this act of creating their own sovereign spaces directly into the concept of futurisms.
The report specifically references Afro and Indigenous futurism, noting the concept is heavily credited to the academic work of scholar Dr. Grace Dillon.
It's a really powerful framework.
Now, I've heard the term Afrofuturism used in art and literature, like the aesthetic of Wakanda in Black Panther, or the sci-fi works of Octavia Butler. But how do the authors apply it here as a policy framework or a psychological survival tool?
In the context of this report, the authors describe Indigenous futurism as a radical act of political and cultural imagination. They frame it as the active process of decolonizing the future.
Okay, what does that mean practically?
Well, the text argues that for centuries, the colonial state has utilized policies to try and ensure that Indigenous people have no future, or at best, a future where they are fully assimilated and invisible.
Right. And for a Two-Spirit person, the authors note that merely existing day-to-day often requires employing exhausting survival tactics just to stay alive.
So how does futurism counter that? The report explains that Indigenous futurism asks a radical question.
What's the question?
What does a world look like where violence against you is not a given? What does a future look like where you construct your own self-determined narrative rather than spending all your energy just reacting to colonial trauma?
It is the psychological exercise of envisioning a sovereign future and then building the policies needed to reach it. It's the audacity to dream of a world where you aren't just surviving, you are thriving.
The authors quote writer Billy Ray Belcourt in this section, who says that some Indigenous people are already on their way to the future, conjuring a space-time where violence isn't a required survival tactic.
That is so profound. And there's a specific quote in the report that I think captures this resurgence perfectly. It comes from Richard Jenkins, the former Director General of the Two Spirits in Motion Society.
Oh, yes. The medicine bundle quote.
Yeah, the text includes his incredibly powerful assertion that 2S LGBTQQIA plus people are the medicine bundles of their communities.
The authors highlight that as a profound cultural metaphor. A medicine bundle, in many Indigenous traditions, is a highly sacred, carefully curated collection of items used for protection, healing, and ceremony.
By identifying two-spirit people as the medicine bundles, Jenkins is asserting, and the report agrees, that they hold the essential healing properties needed by the entire community.
It completely flips the narrative of marginalization.
Exactly. It's as if society amputated a vital limb. Resurgence isn't just about putting a bandage on it. It's about reattaching the medicine bundle, the two-spirit people, so the whole family and community circle can finally heal.
The text frames them not as an accessory to the culture, but as the cure to the colonial trauma. But the authors also bring up a painful paradox in this section, and the report does not shy away from it.
Right, the internalized issues.
They argue that the final frontier for two-spirit resurgence isn't just fighting the Canadian state or mainstream queer racism. The text states that the final, perhaps most difficult frontier is fighting the internalized homophobia and transphobia that exists within Indigenous communities themselves.
Because the colonial programming, the gendercide, the Indian Act, the residential schools, worked so effectively over generations. The authors argue that these systems successfully implanted heteropatriarchy deep into some community spaces.
Exactly. The report challenges Indigenous leadership directly on this point. The authors demand that resurgence take hold in every context of Indigenous governance, ceremony, health, and education.
It's a call to actively return to that pre-colonial acceptance.
The text argues that a community cannot truly decolonize its nation while simultaneously upholding the rigid gender binaries forced upon them by the colonizer.
Which perfectly sets the stage for the final and perhaps most structurally important section of the document, the baskets framework.
Yes, the recommendations.
This is where the authors take all this deep philosophy, the history, the fire metaphor, and translate it into concrete, actionable policy solutions. How do we practically build this futurist reality?
The report proposes a vast array of recommendations grouped into what they call baskets, covering immediate short-term and long-term goals.
Let's look at how the authors break down these action plan highlights.
The authors start with the justice basket, which they argue requires immediate life-saving attention.
The report calls for a massive systemic overhaul of how the justice and law enforcement systems interact with 2S LGBTQQIA plus individuals.
One specific, immediate demand the authors make is for police to stop using birth names, which the community refers to as dead naming, and assign genders on missing persons reports and Amber Alerts.
Let's look at the mechanical failure the authors are pointing out here. If a trans woman goes missing and the police put out a public alert looking for a man, utilizing a birth name she hasn't used in a decade, her own community isn't going to recognize the alert.
Right, they wouldn't even know it was her.
Exactly. The report argues this administrative rigidity actively hinders finding missing people.
The authors frame it as a lethal administrative failure. Moving to the long-term justice recommendations, the report pushes for actual systemic alternatives. They strongly advocate for establishing alternative Indigenous justice models.
The text mentions sentencing circles. For those unfamiliar, how does the report differentiate a sentencing circle from a standard Western courtroom?
The authors highlight that a Western court is inherently adversarial. You have a judge elevated on high, a prosecutor battling a defense attorney, and the focus is heavily on punitive incarceration.
It's about punishing the crime.
Right. But a sentencing circle, as supported by the report, brings the offender, the victim, community elders, and family members together in a circle.
The focus shifts from pure punishment to understanding the root causes of the behavior, ensuring restitution, and attempting to heal the rupture in the community fabric.
The authors suggest this is crucial because the Western justice system is historically viewed not as a source of justice, but as a primary source of trauma for Indigenous people.
Furthermore, the report calls for trauma-informed, culturally safe support within existing prisons that allows for healing through ceremony rather than just isolation.
Then, moving to the health and wellness basket, the author's recommendations are just as paradigm shifting.
They aren't just asking for the government to hire more doctors.
No, the text calls for structural funding to establish traditional medicine chests and greenhouses, nationally and locally, ensuring Two-Spirit people can access traditional plant medicines.
They also specifically demand specialized healing and treatment centers that operate entirely outside the gender binary.
The report explains the necessity of this by pointing out how standard medical facilities often fail trans individuals.
For example,
Well, if a trans person seeks inpatient addiction treatment, they're often forced into a strict male or female ward based on their biology or legal documents, where they frequently face violence, harassment, or deep psychological distress.
the authors argue for creating healthcare infrastructure that affirms their identity, rather than treating their identity as a secondary bureaucratic complication to be managed.
Exactly. It needs to be built for them from the ground up.
And under the culture and housing basket, this is where the author's idea of futurism really seems to take physical shape. They propose creating a national Indigenous arts center, arguing for a dedicated, funded physical space for 2SLGBTQQIA plus expressions to be showcased and celebrated on a national level.
And crucially, the authors tie cultural resurgence directly back to language. There is a strong call in the report for dedicated, continuous funding for language revitalization programs, specifically aimed at recovering those lost gender terms we talked about earlier.
The text advocates for funding to comb the archives, consult with elders, and systematically restore the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit words for the full spectrum of identities.
Because, as the authors noted, if you give a youth the ancestral word for who they are, you give them their history back.
They also tackle the stark economic realities in this basket. The report explicitly calls for the establishment of a guaranteed annual income and a national strategy to end 2SLGBTQQIA plus homelessness through safe, dedicated housing.
The author's logic here is clear. It's nearly impossible to focus on cultural resurgence or healing when you are literally sleeping on the street and focus purely on basic survival.
To anchor all of these domestic policy demands, the report makes a critical overarching demand regarding international law.
Yes, the authors demand that UNDRP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, be explicitly expanded to protect 2SLGBTQQIA plus rights.
Let's clarify what UNDRIP is for a moment for the listener. It's a comprehensive international instrument adopted by the UN in 2007 that outlines the minimum standards for the survival, dignity, and well-being of Indigenous peoples worldwide.
It covers rights to land, self-determination, and culture.
So why does the report argue it needs explicit expansion? Doesn't UNDRIP theoretically protect all Indigenous people already?
It theoretically does, but the authors of the report point out a historical reality. Broad human rights documents have a habit of letting gender-diverse people fall through the cracks if they aren't explicitly named.
The text argues that unless the language is precise, state governments will often default to heteronormative interpretations of family and community rights.
By demanding the explicit expansion of UNDRI articles to include the right to autonomous self-determination of gender identity without facing violence or forced assimilation, the authors are attempting to solidify these protections on a global, undeniable scale.
And the report is vital to remember on this point. The authors stress that these calls to justice are not asking governments to grant them new, modern, progressive rights.
They frame these demands as the required restoration of ancient historical roles and protections that were violently stolen.
What's so striking about this demand is exactly how they frame it. They argue this isn't a request for a progressive new policy, but a demand for the return of stolen property, in this case, their cultural place and their safety.
It's a very powerful distinction.
We have covered an incredible amount of ground today exploring this text. We started by looking at how the authors describe a map of history that had been intentionally erased, a complex ecosystem that was forcibly replaced with a rigid monocrop.
We walked through the text's detailing of how the immense reverence of pre-contact societies was met with the devastating, calculated machinery of colonial gendercide.
From the Spanish colonizers to the bureaucratic erasure of the Indian Act and the psychological violence of the residential schools.
We examine how the report argues that mainstream tools like intersectionality fail to capture the full ecosystem of this experience, necessitating the author's brilliant metaphor of the fire to center cultural strength rather than just trauma.
We look squarely at the frontline realities the authors gathered, the urgent needs for Inuit-specific care, the trans housing crisis, and the radical call for bodily autonomy, decriminalization, and harm reduction for those in the sex trade.
And finally, we witnessed the vibrant resurgence documented in the text, with two spirit people stepping forward as the medicine bundles, claiming their indigenous futurism and laying down a concrete, actionable framework for justice, health, and cultural restoration.
To you, the listener, we hope this deep dive into the text has provided a thorough understanding of the author's arguments. Engaging with a document like the MMIWG2SLGBTQQIA plus National Action Plan changes how we view history, how we understand the fluidity of gender, and how we recognize the hidden systemic architectures of our society.
The authors challenge us to stop looking just at the individual logs of marginalized identities and to step back and understand the heat, the fuel, and the entirety of the fire.
It certainly challenges the traditional narratives we are often taught.
Yep.
As we wrap up our exploration of this document today, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, building on the profound historical shifts the authors outlined.
It's a big one.
If an invading culture can almost entirely erase a complex, spiritually rich, multi-gendered society in just a few generations, using the stroke of a legislative pen, the withholding of food rations, and the policing of language, what profound truths about our own human nature might we currently be entirely blind to, simply because we no longer have the words to describe them?
That is the ultimate question this history asks of us.
Thanks for diving deep with us. See you next time.